on the, oh my god, this guy is a nerd, we're covering the Hacienda de la Chula Ranch and the Alachua Sink. Go through everything from Native American conflict, Civil War, epidemics, Spanish incursion, British incursion, Queen Anne's War, and everything in between. So please, take a walk through a couple hundred years of history with me. And we're back. So, the Hacienda de la Chua, right? This is a very productive area for the people that ended up becoming before the Spanish, the Patano. The Patano people have a very interesting way of producing food for themselves. So, before the Spanish incursion into Florida, all right, as many of you know, disease, firearms, epidemics, all sorts of different stuff ends up leading to about a 90% decline of all Florida natives in Spanish La Florida by about 1700, all right? I'm portraying about 1720. The ranch doesn't even last till 1720, so it started in the mid-17th century and only makes it to the beginning of the 18th century. Only to about 1706 at the end of Queen Anne's War, but we'll get a little bit into that in a second. So, who starts this place? Who starts this wonderful big area, right? Well, it wasn't started. The Alachua Sink is actually part of the watershed for the Swanee River and the St. John's. So they're going to funnel down to this area where it's carved out the limestone and there's a big natural spring here. In the spring, it's going to produce a lot of water, and into the late 1800s, it's going to end up flooding, where the Seminole people can even travel through this area all by boat where I'm standing, this entire area. It's in like a big bowl, if you want to think about it like that, right? So why was it founded? Why was it here, right? This seems like pretty inhospitable, which is exactly what it was. So the Patano people, you got to think the Timucua are out to the east over by the St. John's and St. Augustine, all right? To our west are going to be the Appalachian people, not the Apache, but the Appalachian, all right? This is going to be the Tallahassee area. It's very productive for agricultural and farming, right? And then south of us, you're going to have the Ocala. Comes from Ocala, right? That's where the name for the city actually comes from, right? Very, very interesting. The more you go through Florida history, the more you see these names kind of pop up all over the place that have native origin. That's why a lot of them sound difficult or look difficult to spell, per se, right? So Menendez Marquez is going to be a Spanish royalty, per se. He's going to come here to La Florida, and at this point in the mid-17th century, this area has gone through quite a bit of change prior to that before they even start to try and settle this, right? So the Hacienda de la Chua, right, gets its name from the Timucua word for sinkhole. It also comes from the Patano word for jug, you might think, because it's like a big bowl, like I said. So it fills with water and floods out to the surrounding area pretty often. So that's where it ends up getting its name from, right? So this area ended up housing over 1/3 of all Spanish cattle in La Florida, which includes parts of Georgia, Alabama, and modern-day Louisiana, right? All the way out to Mobile Bay, all the way up to the Guale provinces, all the way up the southern coast of Georgia, right? So all of this cattle comes to this area because of those Patano people. Previously, their way of inducing agriculture and hunting is to clean burn the entire area surrounding this, right? Not just the bowl, but outside surrounding provinces, right? So when you clear cut that by burning it, one, you open up area for agriculture, and two, it makes hunting significantly easier. Something comes out into your area, your people can see it, you can work around it into some sort of pincer move and attack it. Boom, you got dinner, baby. This opened up many different ways the Spanish could have impacted the area, right? So even prior to the mid-17th century, this area has undergone quite a bit of, per se, ravaging, right? So the idea that the New World is fought solely against Europeans, against the Native Americans, is just inherently wrong, right? The Europeans had a lot of things that the natives here wanted, not just in La Florida, but all of the New World, right? These precious metals, metal in general for axes and knives, which become very important for them. Furs for trading, even Indian captives. They would come down in big raiding parties and steal a bunch of native people, run back to their native land and try and sell them to the Europeans for labor, right? Especially coming into the 18th century when most native people end up lie decimated from epidemics and disease and conflict, which is no different from the area around here, right? So by about 1600, Spain over in St. Augustine, right, is going to set up multiple different land tracts for the area interior Florida. Interior Florida is home to native peoples who they've tried to pacify in previous decades, which has somewhat worked, but for different reasons, more so because they don't have enough people to fight back. They really don't want to help provide for the Spaniards because they provide disease and they almost work them to death. So in the first one in 1614, there's an epidemic that strikes this area, and then the Spaniards end up calling the interior Florida the inhabitable lands because as you'll see, every decade or so, another epidemic is going to hit this area, or a civil war starts, or some sort of conflict erupts that cause the lives of thousands, even tens of thousands to die over a decade or two, right? Pretty brutal stuff in this area of Florida. So in 1648 and 1649, you're going to have the largest epidemic that hits this area. It hits the Patano people especially hard, and by the end of it, they have about 10,000 people in the area about 2 decades prior. By this point, there's maybe 200, right? And they all live at about 5 separate missions in the surrounding area surrounding Gainesville. The Alachua Sink, by the way, is just south of Gainesville and just north of Micanopy, all right? I've covered that in a past post, and there's also going to be a lot of Seminole War activity in this area, but for the moment, since I'm dressed in this lovely garb, we're going to go with a little bit of 18th century Spanish stuff. So after these epidemics strike, it's going to leave the people decimated, and you would think, okay, there's probably not many left. But into 1656, right, we're going to have the thing called by the Spaniards the Great Rebellion. At this point, all of the remaining Patano, Ocala, Apalache, Tamokwa, all sorts of different native groups that come together into these little confederations to live in these mission sites are going to erupt into a large civil war. This civil war is not necessarily fought by the Spaniards against the resisting natives, but the loyal natives to the resisting natives. So it's a civil war. You have two sides coming together, fighting over what little land they're able to grab and try and farm off of and get the respect of the Europeans. This is going to lead to a big divide that most people think the American Revolution, French and Indian War is the start of European hostilities over here. No. All right, we're gonna get to that. So what comes next? But in 1670, a big, small little place called Charlestown, now called Charleston, South Carolina, is going to be founded, and that represents a big problem for the Spaniards because that is the closest large British colony to Spanish La Florida. All right. At this point forward into the 18th century, they're going to continuously challenge each other over who gets access to this bountiful land. And by the end of it, the Spaniards end up losing out and are restricted back to east of the St. Johns River and the Panhandle region. And even that is subject to Allied native attacks for the next century and a half. Why is it here? So, as I've probably just answered for you, it's because of these Patano people, their way of feeding themselves. It leaves this big savanna area open with a big watershed here that's open to grow lots of crops, but that's not what the Spaniards choose. They choose cattle, all right? So most of the provisions for St. Augustine, because that's the big military presence in La Florida with the Spaniards, that's what they attempt to hold on to, all the way past into the early 1800s, right, is that with all these big savannas, it leaves all this grass for these cattle to graze on, right? There's multiple efforts before the latter part of the 1600s to do such a thing, but they all end up losing out because the natives continuously run in, grab a bunch of cattle, and run back to the woods before anybody can do anything about it. Money and food, remember, it's little bands of natives running around here. There's no big tribes left. It's the missions with the converted natives, and then you have these little rebel groups running around trying to survive the best they can, right? So the cattle produced here actually works pretty well for the Spaniards. So it's very expensive for them to import beef from Havana, Cuba, which is the next closest Spanish colony, right? Down in Cuba. So that's pretty far for the Spaniards. But just beyond that, it's really expensive. The colony of St. Augustine does not have a whole lot of money. It's a military colony. It's there for a military presence. There's no sorts of huge agriculture or way to produce a lot of money there. So the Spaniards turned to interior 1875, after most of the native people have been, so unquote, quieted due to ravaged by epidemics and sorts of civil wars. There's not many left, so there's no reason to put up a rebellion. Interior Florida is considered safe, but we'll get down to why that was never ever true. It is still the inhabitable lands. Like I said, it's about 102 real feel right now, so you can bet I'm sweating quite a bit right now, and I don't even have my large greatcoat on, nor do I have all of my gear or a musket with me. So add about 25 pounds to all that, now we're talking. All right, so you're producing all these cattle in this area, and it ends up being pretty lucrative for the Marquez family. All right, they're importing quite a bit of beef back to St. Augustine to feed in the garrison, because in 1672, in response to the building of Charlestown and the 1668 raid of St. Augustine by Robert Searles, he's going to come out here and with all these cattle produce a lot of money selling to the garrison at St. Augustine, because in 1672 they start building the Castillo de San Marcos. All right, it's going to be the 10th fort in St. Augustine, but it's the first one built out of coquina. Right, coquina is really good for absorbing cannon impact, as well as the only native stone to the area, so it holds up quite a bit better than any sand and wood timber fortification you could build. So this brings a lot of prosperity into La Florida for the first time essentially ever, right? And you're having people come here to work on it. You're having native people transporting, working with the Spanish to bring food to it and away from it and try and grow out La Florida and create more of a Spanish presence after the failure of most of the Spanish missions north and west and south of here by the mid 1600s, right? So once they're gathering all of these cattle, they're going to rustle them all the way over to the St. John's and put them on big flat boats and drift them across, where they're going to be taken by the San Francisco de Pulpo, which is one of the fortifications on the St. John's River. Picolata is going to be the other one. It's just the other side of the St. John's. They're going to drift across that and then rustle them in there. But for Marquez, this isn't as lucrative as it could be, because like when you have a little bit of money, why not have more money? So he's going to actually use a different port. He's not going to use the St. Augustine port because they're going to tax everything he has. He's actually going to use a port on the Swanee River, which is just west of here, right? Just west of Gainesville. So it's a lot closer to the Spaniards that was here. It's about 17 leagues compared to about 35 to St. Augustine, so that's pretty far. The port at St. Martin, which is going to be another mission site for the Spaniards. So the natives in this area are pacified, as well as they help arm interior Florida. Because a lot of the soldiers that make up the Spanish garrison of La Florida are mainly natives, right? In St. Augustine, you have a big Spanish presence. At Pensacola, you end up having a big native presence. And at Appalachia, which is now Tallahassee, there's going to be a fort over there. Going to have a Spanish presence. The rest of it, the rest of the interior and their fortifications, because they have a lot of forts and missions, is going to be held up by essentially natives. It's a lot of natives fighting each other. Again, this kind of civil war idea between, ooh, why are you allying with these people? They're killing us, they're robbing us, they're taking everything we have, compared to, this is the best shot we essentially have. We're going to lose out in the end, so we should help the natives, as well as religion. Religion's a big confounding factor for the 18th century, in the 17th, and the 16th, and the 15th, and 14th, and 12th. Religion, only up till recently, has been a really important driving factor for most colonial nations, right? Especially natives. You convert them, believe in your God, it's a lot easier to send them out to go do your bidding, right? So after sending these cattle across to St. Augustine, not making a lot of money, uses the Swanee River on this port. Becomes a little bit more lucrative to him, except for this gets noticed, right? So here at the Alachua Ranch, it's going to be very enticing to not just rebel native groups, but also other colonial powers. But to that, more so pirates, right? So in 1682 is going to be the first large-scale attack on the Alachua Ranch. At this point, it's at its maximum production rate, right? Is you're going to have a group of about 35 French buccaneers who are coming from the Eclote Key, which is just outside of Tampa Bay, a little bit north, so it's pretty close to the Swanee River. They're going to have a group of 35 come up the Swanee River, and they're going to come probe this area looking for provisions and for money they can make, right? So when they do this, they're going to happen on the very large Alachua Ranch. All right, it's pretty much the only large-scale operation of any sort going on in the area. The French think, hey, they got food and they can sell them for money. Boom, great idea for the French buccaneers, right? A buccaneer is very close to a pirate and a privateer. Those terms basically are the same. The only difference is where they come from origin and who hires them, right? So pirates are like these rogue people going off raiding whoever they want. Privateers are hired by the government to go harass somebody else. Buccaneers are recruited from the coastal islands, typically French natives to that area, after a couple generations, and they decide to do the same idea. And they also become privateers. So yeah, it's a nice little fun, close world, you know? So in this attack, right, which is going to be probably the largest and most recorded of the several that end up happening at the Alachua Ranch, is that 35 are going to come through this area and they're going to surprise the Marquez family and all their ranch hands and their slaves at about 2 a.m. in the morning, right? It's really dark out. You can't see anything. All they hear is a bunch of men shouting and running out of nowhere, and they end up taking 5 family members hostage. So when they take them hostage, they're basically like, okay, give us 150 cattle as payment for ransom, and whatever money you have, we'll give them back. Well, the Marquez family doesn't actually get a chance to respond to this because it takes a little bit of time for this to get to the survivors, but especially St. Augustine, right? That's pretty far, again, about 30, 35 leagues from here. The French buccaneers are going to end up retreating back towards the Suwannee River with their hostages, waiting to get some sort of word or trade, right? But on the way there, they're going to be ambushed by 3 Timucua chiefs who got word of this, and they're, again, supporting the Spaniards here. And they're going to run out of the woods when they're on the way back, fire into them, and in the chaos, they're going to release all their hostages and retreat back down the Suwannee River to their ships. All right. So essentially, in the end, it was very unsuccessful for the French buccaneers, but this tells Spain something, that if they're going to have any sort of prosperity in this region, it needs to be defended, right? So their first act, which I think is got good heart, a little goofy, is to go up the Suwannee River, which they're using to trade, but St. Augustine doesn't really like that. So the governor erects a barricade in the river made of a bunch of brush and large logs and chained together. No, right? So the Suwannee River, like most of our brothers' Wadi in Florida, floods all the time. So when it floods that same year, it wipes out the entire barricade. All that work that it took to make that, nothing, right? So that's not going to be the answer here for the Alachua Ranch and any sort of way to ensure their prosperity here. So in 1684, so this is only 2 years later, right, they're going to get attacked by some French corsairs. All right, again, another term that's very similar to the ones I've mentioned previously. They're going to rush out the woods at the same time and fire several musket shots at the family homestead, which would have been some sort of log house, essentially. So think like Lincoln log builder house, but 2-story with a bunch of gun ports in it, right? We also call it a blockhouse. They're all over the frontier. You look up the term blockhouse, you'll see what I'm talking about. A little bit later on, they're going to add some soldiers to the blockhouse here in return for all these attacks that are happening to it. And they're going to add a log palisade around it, which is just a log wall, essentially. It's, from what I've done with my research, again, there's not a whole lot of archaeological evidence for the ranch. A lot of it was pretty temporary, and this was several hundred years ago. So Florida likes to eat up any sort of earthen materials very rapidly. Here, and the fortification they're making, they're starting to think, okay, we have a little bit of security. But then another factor decides to roll into the equation. As most things do, they like to get a little bit more complicated. So Spanish La Florida, right, owned by the Spaniards. North of here is the British colonies. A little bit into the 18th century, Savannah's founded, but not quite yet. But you still have a lot of British incursion down to this area here. Quite a bit north of here, though. But what do the British bring with them, as well as the Spaniards did, is African-American slaves, right? Chattel slavery at this area is really becoming something that the future colonies want to hold on to. It's something really prosperous for them. It's easy access to labor, which is a lot of what they need in the area. They first turned to the natives, but with epidemics and conflict raging them constantly, there's no sustainable population for them. So they continuously start importing slaves here. So you get a lot of runaways, and they flee down to La Florida. And this is a theme for several hundred years. A big reason why the Seminole War erupts, because the Creek are harboring mulattoes, which are a blend of Spanish heritage, Native heritage with African Americans, right? And that's going to lead to the first, second, and third Seminole Wars of the 19th century, but that's a talk for a completely different day, right? So with all these runaways and these native groups and these French and these British, everybody wants a piece of the action out here, right? There's not a whole lot in interior Florida. So this is where you're going to pick up provisions, and this is where you're going to get money if you're going to try and attack it. Again, but then things get more interesting, right? So as I've mentioned earlier, Queen Anne's War, called the War of Spanish Succession, or Austrian Succession, over in Europe, right? The very beginning of the 18th century starts in 1702, goes to about 1718. 1718 is when they start issuing uniforms to the Spanish garrison here, very similar to what I'm wearing today. So I'm dressed a little bit after this, but considering there's nothing here but probably some ruins about 3 feet underground, I'd say we're close enough, right? So in 1702, Queen Anne's War erupts. In 1702, the first siege of St. Augustine is going to take place. All right, it's going to be unsuccessful for the British because they don't have enough big cannon to bombard it. But after it, they're low on provisions and they have to march all the way back to South Carolina to Charlestown. They're going to end up coming out west here first, and they're going to come through the Alachua area and the Patano people, and they're going to end up enslaving a good majority of them, and the Allied Creek with the British are going to end up killing a lot of them, stealing what they have, moving on, burning what they have, essentially. So during the war, in 1702 through 1706, because in 1706 they ended up getting abandoned, they're attacked about 3 to 4 different times by roaming bands that shoot a couple musket shots, steal a bunch of cattle while everybody's disorganized, running around getting ready to fight, and then they run away. All right. And then by the time they're ready to shoot back, no one's there. All right. It's very easy to steal the several hundred, even several thousand head of cattle roaming the savannah in this bowl-like area you see. The ridge line you see behind me, you cannot quite see it. I'll change that here in a minute. Goes all the way around this area. This whole area is the Alachua Sink. All right. This is where the aquifer comes up through some limestone, and this is the lowland area of that big part of the watershed. So after these attacks that go through all the way 1706, like I said, it gets abandoned. So the family here is going to end up burning the blockhouse that was here, tearing down the palisade, and moving back to St. Augustine. It is just too dangerous to live in interior Florida or anywhere west of the St. Johns or north of it. All right. So Spanish power at this point is confined to St. Augustine, and then eventually over to Pensacola once it gets more soldiers and more provisions sent there and a little bit more money. But that's not a little bit late. This interior Florida is essentially left hollow. The tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of natives that originally lived in the surrounding area, north, south, east, and west, most of them are gone. And either left or confined to missions or impressed as soldiers or to help farm food for the Spanish. All right. There's no big colonial Spanish presence at this point because it's constantly getting raided. So you have big bands of what they would be called quite a bit later, the Seminole. They're called that means wild people for the Spaniards. Is basically people fleeing all the native conflicts to the north of them, started by the British and French, all the way down south to here, right? So this is a pretty interesting place. It's got quite a bit of history. It's got quite a bit going on, which is confounded even more when, again, the Seminole War erupts, when you have large bands of roaming natives, which are pretty much coalitions of different native groups from all over the future-to-be country, allied with the Spanish mulattoes, the Creoles. It's this hodgepodge of people. And they're the only native people to essentially resist successfully U.S. incursion. I mean, by the end of the Third Seminole War, there is maybe 250 of them left in the glades, but in the end they were successful, and now they got a pretty nice living off of white man's gambling. So, you know, hey, you win in the end a little bit, I guess, I suppose. Not so lucky for a majority of other native tribes, but again, that's a story for another reason why this area ends up getting deserted is not just because of all the attacks in the area. It's also the cost of what they're trying to do here, right? It's expensive to have to maintain all these cattle and all of these hands and slaves to help run it. But it's not really worth it in the end when the price of the product you're selling is increasingly diminishing, right? So by about 1651, one head of cattle was worth 21 to 25 pesos, right? By 1682, about 30 years later, they're worth about 12 pesos. In about 1702, right, at the start of Queen Anne's War, a head of cattle is only worth 1 to 2 pesos, right? So there's no real reason to keep up a garrison here and try and operate a ranch here when you're constantly being attacked, so your lives are in danger, and there's no money to be made, right? So that's essentially what leads to the abandonment of this settlement. A very interesting history, if I do say so myself. It was very interesting to come out here in my period garb to try and educate and especially entertain any of y'all that are still watching, and I really do appreciate it. So I wish you a great rest of your day, and take it easy.